Basement, a slow ticking, the bang and shudder of the propane furnace. Outside, old tree limbs creak and pop above the single-story house. Robins and finches deliver the news of morning, but more loudly than usual, as if they are greeting sunlight for the very first time. Eyes closed, cheek pressed into the foam pillow she's slept on for decades, Jackie curls onto her side toward the middle of the mattress. She rubs her feet together, circles the pillow with both arms, and burrows deeper into the familiar softness. The lingering fragrance of dryer sheets across the gap between wake and sleep, where ghost sounds of crowded mornings fill her ears. Cabinet doors slamming shut, young voices tangling from the kitchen, a chair squeaking along the linoleum floor. An old, low flame of duty flickers to life. Lunches to pack, report cards to sign, laundry to graduate from the washing machine to the dryer, hamburger meat to move from the freezer to the refrigerator to thaw, a blouse to iron for work, a rapid volley of shouts, "Give it back, leave me alone, I'm telling mom." A crow's mad caw fouls the air, "Nah, nah." The shrill holler repeating. Jackie refuses to open her eyes. Half dream of facing a day busy with errands and work and children has gone. "Nah, nah." I apologize for the crow impersonation. The almost words feel like rocks thrown at her. She winces and pulls the bedding around her shoulders. The crow continues, its call bossier, more human. "Now," it insists. Now. When it finally stops, Jackie listens for the noise of her squabbling children, both of whom have long since grown up and moved out. She tries to will the old feeling of too many demands in her time to return, but she only becomes more awake and aware of the morning as it actually is. The slapping shade, the tick and moan of the furnace, the straining hum of the refrigerator in the empty kitchen, and on the other side of her bedroom door, what is always there, lifeless rooms and a day that does not need her.
Great, thank you. I think everyone now has a sense of the lyricism of your work. So thank you very much. I'm wondering, like your first novel, Did You Ever Have a Family? This novel is presented from the perspectives of many different characters, the three main women and then some other people in their lives. It's a really fascinating structure for the reader, as the secrets of the past, as you said earlier, are very slowly unspooled for the reader. And there is a sense of mystery and tension that builds as well. Did you set out to begin this book like that as you did the first one? Or did you start with an image, a character, a voice? And did you know where you were going to end up? Or did it slowly fall into place? Because it's a really complex structure. If you tried to map it out, it would be all over the place, right?
Yeah.
So how did you end up
that
like
structure kicked my ass for years, but it's not how I started out, actually. I started out, while I was writing Did You Ever Have a Family, if you read the book, you may remember there's a minor character who is the caterer of a wedding that never actually gets to happen. And he turns up in his mother's driveway, and his mother is Jackie. And so this woman makes a very brief appearance at the beginning of Did You Ever Have a Family? And my experience of her was a little bit sort of like passing somebody in a car and you just sort of catch a glimpse of them. But there's something there that you just kind of can't shake. And so that was my experience with her. And, she was in her late 60s. She was in her bathrobe, her porch lights on in the middle of the day. She's consoling her son, who's lost one of his closest friends. And so her son, the character of her son was not very primary to Did You Ever Have a Family? But she just was the one that held my attention. And so I kept writing her separately. And I wrote about her childhood friendship with this, daughter of this New York family who would come up on the weekends. And for a minute early on in the writing of that book, I thought that Jackie and that sort of, that little pod of characters may be important. It very soon became clear that the book was not going to accommodate her or Dana, her friend. And yet I kept on going back and writing her parents. Like I have just reams of pages on this woman's family. Like, and so I just was so, I don't know, I was really interested in her, and then this friendship. And so she served a function when I was writing Did You Ever Have a Family, which was when I would hit a knot in the writing, or something would be like stumping me. If I just couldn't go forward, I would just jump out of what was troubling me and go into the Jackie sections, and I would just write this woman's life. And it was like, and I didn't expect anything of it, except I thought that maybe some aspect of her family or her relationship would inform the unfolding story that was happening in Did You Ever Have a Family? And so, so I just kept on with her, and then I finished Did You Ever Have a Family, and then just went back to her, and so that was the very beginning of the book, and so I had no expectations of it, and then I overheard somebody tell a story. It's an amazing story. And it was a guy who's probably in his late 70s, early 80s, and he told a story of being in Lakeville at the Town Grove at a picnic or a party. I don't remember exactly what the day was, with his young family, his wife and his young kids. And he went to run an errand. And so I'm imagining in my mind now, everything is in the late 60s because that's what I placed the book. But so I think it was in the late 60s, somewhere around there. Anyway, there was a group of New Yorkers at the, at wherever he went to run his errand, and he fell in with them, and they invited him to go up a mountain to just hang out and party with them. And he didn't come back for 2 months. And so this is a true story. This is a story I'm overhearing. And he just didn't come back. And that story it was like a lightning bolt. And I just immediately sort of married it to this, circumstance of Jackie, this character, and her friend. And the book just kind of came into view for me at that point. Wow. And then I just had to figure out how to tell the story. And that was much more difficult than I anticipated.
Wow. Was Lupita there at that point as well?
She was as a kind of a figment, like she was a girl who was sort of hovering at the edge of their friendship, sort of wanting in, but like that she was the daughter of the caretaker that hadn't really come into view. But there was a triangulation in that relationship at that point. It just wasn't fully articulated.
Wow, that's really fascinating. I think for your audience tonight, we have the added element in the discussion of most of the people here being from Sharon. So if they've read this book or the earlier book, as we were talking about before we started, they're going to recognize a lot of names, a lot of real landmarks that are pulled sort of right off of the map, like Hospital Hill Road or Upper Main Street, Trotta's Market, which used to be in Millerton. I think you moved Undermountain Road from Salisbury to Sharon. I don't know if there's an Undermountain Road in Sharon. The high school is called Housatonic Valley Regional High School. I was wondering if Hatch Pond might be Mudge Pond. Who knows?
Of course it is.
But as you said earlier, you name everything around us, you name with the real name. So why did you change Sharon to Wells?
I needed to be able to leap into a fictional place. As much as it is informed by Sharon, it's not Sharon. And because Did You Ever Have a Family is set in Wells, and if you follow that landscape, that one is much more frustrating, I think, for people who know Sharon in the area very well, because you'll be on a road that then forks into a complete fantasy place that doesn't exist. So I've imagined reading it as somebody from Sharon and just like hurling in the book at various points, because the landscape of that book is really like a perfect conflation of Barrytown, where we have our house here, where I am right now, and Sharon. And so the landscape of the end of the day is more limited when it comes to Wells. It's Hospital Hill Road. it's this fictional undermountain road that runs along the Housatonic River at the Cornwall border. And so, and there's a little Upper Main Street, there's the Catholic Church, but it's a much less fully articulated, like, physical landscape of Wells. So I think it's a little less frustrating than Ditch River Family.
Right.
But in both books, I needed the room to be able to create and sort of shape the landscape to the needs of the story. And so if it was Sharon, I couldn't do that. And so it really, it like, listen, like, I do a lot of these Zoom events, especially lately, and readings, and like Sharon, I talk about inside and out and backwards and forwards. So it's very weird to actually speak to the people of Sharon,
Right.
because I talk about the place a lot. It looms very large for me. It's a place I never got over, and I never will. And so, but I'm finishing. I'm not finishing, but I'm working on another book, which hopefully is the last of these books that are set in Wells. And I hope I graduate to a place that's beyond Sharon at some point. But I also understand that even if I do on the surface, there'll be some aspect of where I'm from that will figure in, I'm sure.
Right. I don't think we ever leave those places behind that we, grow up in. I have to say, reading the earlier novel, I was frustrated when the characters are walking on the green, because they'd be walking and then they'd pass a building that wasn't next to the building that you said it was next to.
Yes, I know.
And I'd be like, well, I'm there every day in the library, and that's not where it is. So, wait, that's not right.
Right, the library is in that book, but it's not exactly where it is in the town.
I think it was next door to Town Hall, and I said, no, it's not next door to Town Hall, something like that. So, I think that you have a real gift for capturing the challenges and emotions and confusion of childhood and adolescence, especially in both of the books. And I have to say, as a mother of two teenagers here in Sharon, I think you capture that unique nature of growing up in a town like this, the difficulties in a small town, a town with a big economic disparity between the richest and poorest residents, the full-time weekender dynamic, that kind of thing. Do you think this has changed since you grew up here, or are these differences even more acute now?
I don't know. I know what that was when I was growing up, and I know what it was from my perspective anyway, in high school and college, and a little while after. I kept on coming back. There were friends who were still there. I don't really know, but I have a sense of it, only because, where we are now in Barrytown and Rhinebeck, which are very different than Sharon. Like, it's a whole different kind of ecosystem. But I hear the locals kind of talk about the rising tide of the New Yorkers, and the vanishing of farms. Although farms here are much more, like, I don't know why they last longer here. I remember my mother had a statistic about when we moved to Sharon, which would have been in 77, 78, that there were something like between 25 and 30 working farms in Sharon. And then now, I don't know if this is true, and somebody on this call will know this, but that there's like 2 working farms in Sharon. And that to me is just, for a town with so few people, like, to have that many working farms and then to go, so that in and of itself is a big difference. And I have to expect it's changed. And the trend then was that the prices were going up and local families were having a harder time staying. I mean, the thing that I'm really interested in is how, the infrastructure of a town like Sharon, like, sustains when the, working class families, no longer can stay. Because at least when I lived in Sharon, the volunteer fire department was a backbone of the town. And so, I am now a weekender. I now, like, come up on the weekends. Like, I don't know other weekenders who are, active participants in the volunteer fire department in the towns, but they need them. So, like, I can imagine that is creating, like, different challenges for the town. So the truth is, I don't know. The one thing I do know is that we didn't have social media growing up. And so for me as a kid who was not really from, my family wasn't from Sharon. My father was an airline pilot. My mom was a painter. And like, so we weren't really from Sharon, but we weren't from New York by any stretch. And so we were sort of like, so I felt like I was like equally observant of both landscapes of people. But the ones that captured my imagination the most were the New Yorkers, because they came up on the weekends in fancy cars and lived in beautiful houses, and just had this kind of aura of otherness. Like it was like New York City was an unimaginable place for me. My parents didn't come from cities in that way. They weren't like terribly sophisticated in that kind of way. And so all we had was sort of like what we could imagine, you know, what their lives would be like, you know, and so they were kind of a big presence even when they weren't there for somebody like me. And there were lots of kids like who grew up in Sharon who I don't think cared a lick about the New Yorkers, or if they did, it was purely transactional. But I think for me, like I had a sense of otherness myself. And so I spent a lot of time imagining into their lives, and I read a lot of books. And so I could see how certain lives happened in New York through, like, you know, through the lens of literature. So I would conflate that with whatever my brain could cook up on its own, like, and whatever scraps of evidence were there for me. But there was a lot of like sense of like longing for me about like just sort of that, like what was that like that, and I did have a sense of otherness and a sense of slightly not belonging where I was. And so there was a sense that, oh, where they are may be where I belong. So I think there's a lot of emotion, I think, around when you have a population of people who live in a place like Sharon, who have these people who sort of come in and go out at will, who have like just like a different set of, you know, choices to make in their lives. They have access to different experiences. And they have power because usually it meant that there was money. And so they also employ a lot of people locally. So there's just all those dynamics, which I didn't really have the language for growing up, but registered very powerfully for me emotionally. And you know, and here I am, like I just turned 50 on Sunday. I'm still puzzling through like what it all meant and like what one world, like, you know, meant to the other. But it meant a lot. And it was, there was also a sense of shame too, I think, like of not being as good as they were in some ways. So it's complicated, really complicated.
Yeah, it's interesting. In this new novel, you take that tension, the class tension, but you add another element with the character of Lupita, and you actually tackle the issue of race. And in the late 60s, you say in the book at least that they were the only Mexican family in town. I guess there were very few immigrants at that time, or minorities. And there's still, you know, there are more now, but I think the challenges sadly remain for them. I don't know that that situation has changed very much. What made you want to add that element to this book?
I think because, you know, it's interesting that that element of the book weirdly comes from an experience that I had in on the east end of Long Island, and in my middle 20s and early 30s. My partner and I rented a house in the off season, like from Labor Day to Memorial Day in Amagansett. And we would go out there, and the house there was a long field that looked out onto the Montauk Highway. And in the mornings, I would wake up early and read. And in the mornings, you would see, you know, just, you know, tens and dozens of people walking along this road, sort of, you know, in the early morning. And I asked a friend of ours who lived there, I was like, who are they? And they were, and the answer was very quick and very like complete, which is like, oh, those are the Mexicans. And I was like, what do you mean? Like, and they were walking to like their various jobs. And I remember like trying to figure out where they lived in Amagansett, or if but the fact that they didn't have cars, and, you know, if you've ever been out there, talk about like, you know, just gargantuan displays of wealth and privilege. And that image, and the sort of the mystery of these families who worked in these extremely, beautiful houses, but were sort of invisible on some level, like during the day. Like those was the only time that I ever saw them. And so I think when I was beginning to imagine sort of out from this friendship between Dana and Jackie, and there had been this kind of triangulation that I hadn't exactly named, that this girl would come from a family that was not from the area, but worked for one of the families and was very much like attached to the family in a way. In the story, this is the father organizes this job for the family where the mother and the older daughter in New York working in the apartment, and the younger daughter, Lupita, and the father stay up in Wells as caretaker, and then she goes to Wells Center School. But they're also being sponsored by this family for citizenship, which is a long, slow process. And so the power that this family has over them is enormous. And so much so that it makes okay for them to split up. Like they actually, like their family like splits in half to be able to seize this opportunity for a path to citizenship, which is enormous. And even it's much harder now, but even in 1969 was really difficult and rare. So I also just wanted to explore some of like the vulnerability that somebody would have in that circumstance of like working for a family that is also sponsoring them for citizenship and their whole family and employed the whole family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I loved the character of Lupita. I think she was my favorite. She was really great. I have a sort of off the wall question now. I love books about where the houses, where the real estate in the books are really become a character themselves. They become much more than a setting, and there's so many great examples of that. And I think Edgeweather in the book is a bit like that. And I encourage everyone, if you haven't read the book, when you get to the last scene, it's a really incredible scene. I'll always remember that, I think, for a long time, the final scene in The End of the Day. But I think of books like Rebecca, of course, and Bleak House and Wuthering Heights, and even Hogwarts and Harry Potter and Uncle Tom's Cabin. Do you have any favorite fictional architectural landmarks?
Wow, I don't think I've ever been asked that question. I haven't thought about the ones you name, certainly, without a doubt, like Bleak House and yeah, that's it. That's really interesting. I think of Jude the Obscure and Christminster, and sort of. I think of cities actually first, and sort of like the gathering of buildings, individual houses. Howard's End, and there's certainly those, but I think the first thing that comes to me is sort of like the vision of a city, or the vision of like a particular place that but you like urban centers, certainly, yeah.
That's interesting. Decades ago, I wrote a paper in school about houses in Ibsen, so I kind of always, the architecture is really interesting in Ibsen's work. So anyway, I always like that. So I'm going to add Edgeweather to my list of fictional houses.
I struggled over the descriptions of Edgeweather. Like, it was just to make it plausible. And so there are all sorts of, I've just read like all sorts of stuff about Georgian architecture in New England at the time. And it's also kind of like a fake house in the sense that it's a conflation of Weatherstone and Gore Vidal's old house here in Barrytown called Edgewater. And so, which, if you really conflated those two houses, you'd end up with a Frankenhouse, but that would be past no muster by any architect. But so I had to make big decisions on sort of what it actually was, and then design it from the inside out. And I certainly like to look at nice houses and things like that, but I'm no architect or interior designer, so I had to do a lot of research on even things that took like that you read for a second. I was really, but I had fun doing it too.
That's great. All right, well, I think we have some questions from our guests. I think Karen has a question.
Yes. First, I really liked the book, and I just for some reason, like the embossing of the name on the cover. I don't think
Oh,
I've ever
thanks.
really responded to a cover before, but in it, you have on page 195, you talk about when Lupita and I guess Floyd first meet, but it was the end of the day, and it reminded him of a beach scene.
Mm.
I don't know if you were at Trottis when that happened, but I was one day, 30 some years ago. And I walked out of Trottis or got out of my car, and I thought I was in Rhode Island at the ocean.
Oh,
It smelled like the ocean. It was warm, moist air, the clouds. So I was really tickled by that sentence.
oh, that makes me happy. I have had that experience, not there. But I had it. I've had it in like parking lots in like very ordinary places, like the
Yeah.
parking lot of Trotta's yeah, or the Sharon grocery store, like where suddenly just the angle of light kind of transforms it, and I had never written that out, and I'd wanted to, and I wanted their moment of meeting to be cinematic and kind of big, and also register in her memory and his as cinematic, as kind of like bigger than everyday life. And there's nothing more everyday life than like the parking lot of Trotta's. And so, but so to have it kind of like washed in the glamour of this kind of end of the day light, like was I'm so glad that resonated as true to you. That makes me happy.
Well, I've never forgotten the day, and like I say, it was probably 30 years ago, at least. The other question was, and this is maybe more of an editor question than a particular book question, but I read on, I don't remember who, a little thing by a writer on Twitter who said, boy, I wish for a year all books and movies would be written in a linear fashion temporally. Is that too, I mean, I can understand in a way, whoever wrote it, you have to follow carefully if it's jumping in time.
Yeah.
You have to put it together, which is good for a reader. But is it passé to do a linear book? Is it?
No, I think there's plenty. I mean, I think it in many ways it's still favored. And I accept and have made peace with the fact that I lose certain people by like structuring the books in the way that I do. But for me also, the structure of the book has to do with like the fact that there is no one, everybody on this call has a relationship to Sharon, and we would each give testimony to like what that was. We could even make big statements about Sharon, like Sharon is this, and every single one of us would have something different to say. And we would contradict each other, and some of us wouldn't like what other people said. And I think that's just the truth of the fact that there isn't one like empirical truth about a place or a situation. But so that's why I structure these books in the way that I have. But there are many books that are published in a linear. There's one book. I want to say it's Lily King's book, Writers and Lovers.
Oh,
That's linear. That traces a period of time over the course of this woman's life, and it really does it. She remembers certain things, like it references the past, but you don't like fully occupy the past in the way that you do in the end of the day. And that book did really well. Like people like loved it, read it quickly, and I read it. I thought it was excellent, so that's just one that comes to mind. But I think and publishers would prefer it too, because they want books that people buy and read and support. And so, oftentimes you'll get a pushback when the structure gets a little too complicated or the writer is.
But since this book was about secrets don't reveal themselves all at one time.
Right.
It makes sense that you're learning a little more.
Right.
As things are revealed. So I think it worked very well.
Oh, thanks. I'm glad to hear it.
Sarah has a question. You're mute. They were unmuted. There you go.
oh, can you hear me now?
Mhm.
Okay, great. So I really, really enjoyed Did You Ever Have a Family? Loved it. It's really stayed with me. I belong to a book group here in Sharon. Almost all the women are from Sharon in the book group. And so we read it maybe 2 years ago. And yeah, I really enjoyed it. I
I'm
thought
so
you have a
glad.
great way of capturing character and place. And I live not too far from the now the fancy Sharon Inn. Used to be the Sharon Motor Inn.
Is it fancy
And
now?
oh yeah, it's very
It's
fancy,
your.
Very fancy.
No.
very fancy. Yeah.
Now the
Oh, wow.
Sharon Country Inn.
Eddie from Mises bought it and gussied it all up.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow.
Um,
That's where Lydia
so,
worked. And did you ever have a family?
yeah. So one of the things I was thinking when you were talking about, and this occurred to me when I was reading Did You Ever Have a Family? Maybe it's a really silly, mundane question, but do you actually, I mean, obviously in your mind, but do you ever actually like draw a map of what you mean by Sharon so that you stay true to your Sharon?
Yeah, I did. I absolutely did. Not at first, because I wanted to sort of have it be somewhat unshackled, especially with Did You Ever Have a Family, because Wells was just beginning to kind of shape. But at a certain point I did, because I have people walking around, from the supermarket back to the apartment, and then, Silas, the kid, is like riding around on his bicycle. I did have to kind of create a fictional landscape, which isn't Sharon, but it definitely follows certain. So, so I did do that. And at a certain point, I do the same. I create timelines, and also kind of plot maps of like when things happen, and because it's especially if you structure a book like this, it's almost impossible to keep it all in your head.
So I have one more question. It's kind of first also to Gretchen. Gretchen, can you get enough copies of this so that we can do this new book for my book group? And then Bill, if we do, we often invite the author to our book group.
Sure.
So I don't know, I might invite you to our book group. It's a lot of fun. We love having the authors. And we like I said, we already read the other books, so it'll be fun.
Absolutely.
Can you, Gretchen, get enough copies of this for a book group?
After about 6 months, the interlibrary, most libraries will not loan out new books for about 6 months.
Gotcha, that's what I figured. Okay. Okay, so maybe in about 6 months. But thank you so much, Bill. I really do enjoy your writing, and I look forward to this one.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope you like it.
I'll just add, if I can, that there are books available for purchase. I know the book group doesn't always want to do that, but it's something that you could read now and then give to a dear friend for a Christmas present, somebody that enjoys a good novel. Bill, I just wanted to, this is a little background, and for some reason, I don't know quite why this information lodges in my brain, but in the 80s, there was a whole herd buyout program that really affected the number of dairy farms in not just Sharon and not just Connecticut, but the whole Northeast, because dairy prices were pegged to the cost of producing milk in the Midwest. Right. And in our little tiny, delightful, rocky fields, it's a whole different ballgame. And so a lot of dairy farms, I'm from Millerton, but I know Connecticut lost a lot of farms, and as did Millerton. And when I first moved there in 1975, there were 28 farms, operating dairy farms, and now there's 2, same kind of deal.
Oh, wow.
But then also when you talk about in Berrytown, the agriculture over there is so much more fruit farming. And
more, absolutely. In fact, we live, there's a place called Montgomery Farms, and all the vegetables that we eat, like through the spring, summer, and fall, are grown across the street. But there's lots of apples and vegetables, and there's lots of that.
And that's sort of because, the Hudson creates this little microclimate that really allows fruit to flourish in ways that they wouldn't flourish where we are, which is only really, as the crow flies, 20 miles away. But just the other, I didn't actually raise my hand just to talk about agriculture, but in terms of the background, you talk about your timelines and the information you put together in some of these families. I mean, you approach this as almost an enormous sort of doctoral dissertation with all this background documentation. And then do you pull out the stories and the people that you need to have in the novel? Maybe that's too broad a question.
No, there's a lot of paring away.
Yeah.
I write really wide, and in order to pare down to what I think is like the essential story. And even though if you read this, you might think I didn't pare down enough, but
There's
but
depth.
there was a lot that was pared down. But also, I also write a lot about I write scenes and you know, all sorts of things in and around the characters just to understand them better. You know, I feel like the more time I spend with them, the more insight I have into them, and then I can kind of anticipate how they would react in a certain situation, what they would think about. And so even though there might be something that I scuttled from the book, I might cherry pick from a scene or that conveyed a certain emotion or a gesture that felt meaningful to another scene. So yeah, it's like sort of creating a treasure trove that you then kind of rob from to make the passages and the sections that do remain in the book as strong as they can be.
A couple of the authors that we've been able to speak with in the last few months have talked about that, you know, they're working with a particular character, and every so often the character kind of sneaks up behind them and surprises them. Like the characters take on this life of their own that appears to be independent of the life that the author has given them. Mm-hmm. And that just astounds me in terms of how the craft, I mean, your craft is so thorough and complete that characters are doing something they didn't necessarily ask them to do. Mm-hmm. Or they stick with you longer than you planned to, and that sort of thing. And I don't know if that's an experience you've had with your characters as well.
It happened in this book really with Jackie the most. I think my first vision of her was a patronizing one that didn't see her fully as just a fully realized, complicated person. And so what emerged in, like, I would say, even in the second year of writing, was her willfulness. Mm-hmm. And once that sort of like came into view and I could start to feel it, I really finally got her. And I think all the writing around her was to kind of was to understand her, and I didn't. And but then when her willfulness really emerged, it just, that surprised me. I was like, oh, right. Like, you're going to force this to happen. You're going to force this to happen under any, and I just got excited by that. So everything that kind of came after that, and even I went back and revised things, was sort of kind of in service of that, was really, because I wanted to see what the consequences for her were for her actions. And her willfulness, I think, is something that she paid a price for. In part, it also. So anyway, I mean, I don't want to give stuff away, but that was a surprise to me, and I was grateful for it because she came into view for me at that point.
And then just one last, I'm sorry, you mentioned that you are working on another novel still, and it's drawing on the same sense of community of characters and places. It
is. It's the you know, there's a I've had a couple of emails about this in the past, but it's a character that comes from the Morrie family. There's some people think that I named the Morries after real Morries who've, you know, had experiences in all the towns in and around, and it's not the case at all. I didn't know any Morries growing up, but I grew up on Morrie Road, and spelled the same, M-O-R-E-Y. And so I named that family after the road that I grew up on. And so I think because that family is, you know, complicated, they mostly live in the valley. They have been in the town for a very long time, generations, and they are really clannish and close. And so they kind of hover at the edge of both books as kind of like an old working class family from the town. And so, but they're never really explored. And so there's a character that comes from that family who's the center of the book I'm working on right now. Yeah. So I can't shake it. But I also feel like in the way that that family in those two books, there's things said about them. It's like, oh, like they're the loudest family at the picnic, and you know, they drink too much, or they're out, that one's always at the tap. But there's a certain kind of profiling that happens with that family, a certain expectation and a certain burden that comes with the name in that family. And there are families I knew like that growing up in Sharon. And I think that had certain expectations of them based on other relatives of theirs who might have done these various things. And so and I felt like in some ways, even in these books, I've kind of relegated them to a sort of, a background and without really kind of giving them a full life. And there's one character who sort of, who comes from that family, lives in the Valley, and it's her experience that I'm writing about.
Sounds great. Well, we hope you can, we'll be able to have the real book signing in person, certainly by the time that book is ready. Wouldn't that be nice, right?
I hope so.
Before we wrap up, could you tell us a little bit about your thoughts on how the publishing world is responding to the pandemic, what kind of changes there are, and if you think there'll be changes that become permanent? I know, for example, there's a printing backlog now in this country, right? A lot of things have been postponed or canceled. So what can you tell us, some inside scoop?
You know, interestingly enough, in the beginning part of the pandemic, it was like everybody like hit the deck and put their hands over their head. Like there was a real freak out because every independent bookstore and every chain bookstore is shut across the country. And there was a mass panic, and no book deals were done. Like nobody was hired. There was just, and that was from mid-March probably to early May at least. And which is I have my own literary agency, and so we're young. We're like barely 6 years old, and so we rely on the deals that we do. So like right out the gate, we were just like, there was no business for us. And it was reflected across the board. People were really panicked. But then people started finding books. And boy, did they. Also the independent bookstores were really amazing. Oblong in Millerton and here in Rhinebeck were incredible with, and I know a little bit about this, just one of my employees' parents own Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and just what they were doing to get books to their customers, also to create events through this technology of Zoom that everybody instantly had to become familiar with, and with readings and seminars. I even did a couple of things, with bookstores across the country to just help generate interest to get people to the websites. And it kind of worked. I mean, by June, the publishers were like having like really record months. Simon & Schuster had, I think, one of the strongest months in the history of the company in June. And a lot of, some of it was responsive to the Trump administration. There were a lot of books that were kind of peeling off that. And then also the Black Lives Matter movement. There were a lot of backlist books that became important. And so there was just suddenly, I mean, some of these books that had been not selling really at all were like selling in the, tens and hundreds of thousands. And so there was a real boon through the summer, and the publishing houses, I think most of them would all report that they were shocked at how well things sort of righted themselves. And so for fiction, for new fiction, I represent a lot of that, that, relies on reviews and coverage. And it's been very hard for fiction that's not topical or, issue driven or connected to the news cycle in any way to get attention. So we've seen definitely less sales for those books. But in terms of like the book tours, there've been Zoom events, and I think everybody's pivoted as best as they can. And it's gone much better than I think most people had hoped.
That's great. That's good to know. It's hopeful, and we have lots of time to read now, right? So
Yeah.
So that's a good thing. I think Karen has one more question.
Yeah, just one as an aside. In my few notes, I have, can't believe he used the Morries name. And then I went, the road he grew up on.
Ah!
Oh, I caught that.
You got it.
I did notice, and I don't know whether it just happened or there was a reason. You mentioned everybody or people who've been to college, their education quite a bit. Is that to kind of type the person? Is education of college years an important
I think that, well,
marker?
in this book it is. I mean, you know, one of the main things for Lupita is that she had qualified for a scholarship to go to a 4-year liberal arts college, which was really the whole goal of the family. You know, and her sister resented her for it, and so they sent her to the Catholic school because they didn't pay rent, but the money that they had, they put toward her education. And so because of the events, which I won't go into detail about, that unspool for her, the one thing that is sort of taken from her is education. And so I think it's very much a presence in the book, even outside of her experience, as a way of kind of illuminating, you know, what the hope for that family was. So later when she, you know, she lives on Kauai, and the university system there only awards on the island a 2-year degree. She gets 2 to sort of like add up to the bachelor's degree that she would have had, and it takes her many years and through the evenings. And I'll tell you, that wasn't the original way I wrote it. One of the things is, you know, writing outside of my experience as a white privileged person who did go to college, you know, choosing to write about a young woman who comes into this country illegally was a big choice to make, and I suffered it because I didn't want to like contribute to any stereotypes. I didn't want to offend anybody who has lived that experience. And so once I finished writing a draft of it, I shared it with a number of women who actually did come into the country the way that Lupita did. And the first one, who is the girlfriend of a friend of mine, and she just said, the thing that you've missed is that she didn't get a college degree, and that would have mattered so much more to her than you've registered it here. And it was very clear. It was the thing that she really was strong about, and it made me think about it a lot. And I went back and included that. And also, what's so great about writing fiction is, like, at first I was like defensive, and then when I actually like could take it in and wrote about how she goes to school and gets both degrees, it just sort of opened up other possibilities for me in terms of like what her experience was. So I was really grateful to have that correction as a way to spend more time with her and give her a more complicated experience on the island.
Thank you.
Any more questions from our audience? I'll just ask one last thing. Was it hard to become an author in terms of being a client for another agent and have somebody represent you to get you to have your work published?
No, I was, you know, in this way, I've been incredibly lucky. Like when I was writing my first book, which was a memoir, and I was on a plane with my boss, who ran the book division of the William Morris Agency at the time. We were heading to Seattle because Starbucks was our client, and we were going out to try and convince them to do a book program, which they did do for a bunch of years. And but we were on the plane, and I had been writing for a while this memoir, and I said to her, I was like, you know, I'm writing this, and she said, and I'm going to sell it. And she's like, I'm your agent, end of discussion. And I actually hadn't thought about who would represent it at all. I wanted her to know, because it also went into like a dark period of my life, and she was my boss and she knew all about that. And, but but I was about to bring it back up again. And that was it. She was incredibly supportive of me. And the next book, and she sold these 2 books. She actually just retired in the last year, but she sold both Did You Ever Have a Family and The End of the Day. She made it very easy. Like, it just, I was incredibly lucky to have that handled with as much confidence and affection as I did. And so what will happen now, we'll see. But it wasn't. I just let her do it. And at the point where I had to be involved, I was. And so, but I'm really easy, because I still feel very lucky to be able to write books and have them published. I don't take it for granted. And if anything, I think of the fact that I write as kind of a burden on everybody, all my clients, and that they have to deal with an agent who writes books. So I don't interrogate the advertising budgets. I don't push them to do anything that they're not doing. It's actually like I'm a probably terrible agent, like when it comes to my own stuff. So, but it's also not my livelihood. You know, I have a day job.
Right. Well, that's great. It's been a wonderful conversation with you. Thank you so much for coming home to Sharon. And as I said earlier, I hope that when your next book is finished, we will be able to gather in person on the Green on the first Friday of August and have a nice evening. So
you too. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you everybody for coming. I appreciate
so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
If you'd like a copy, we have plenty of copies at the library. So please call us or email us tomorrow to order a copy, and we will get it to you. Thanks so much, everybody. Good night.